But because of the demography, we will meet very many people with this disease. And it's important to have a treatment of these patients, and it's difficult. We haven't succeeded, I have to say, oh yes, with cognitive treatments and so on, but not really some good treatment. And John is a well-known and recognized researcher. He received, together with two other people, the Lundbeck Foundation Brain Prize, 1 million euros. Who wouldn't like to have 1 million euros to his research or her research in the future? So it's very impressive. I will welcome you and hope we can have a nice talk here. We have 45 minutes, including questions. And remember, it's streaming, so when you ask questions, you have to have a mic. One thing, and the other thing, you can ask questions on Twitter if you want to do that, because sometimes it's possible to reach all the questions. And then John can ask some of the questions later if you want on Twitter too, if it isn't possible to reach all the questions here today. But first of all, welcome to you, John. The floor is yours.
Thanks for having me early this morning. I look a bit bleary-eyed. I was watching the Brexit debate last night. I'm watching my country drive over a cliff, so I may apply for Danish citizenship before the end of the month. So anyway, thanks for having me for this day at least. So I'm going to talk about the genetic analysis of Alzheimer's disease. I'm going to say where we're up to, and I'm also going to talk about where we are up to in terms of treatment strategies, and which, as you've just heard, has not been all good news. So I'm going to talk about both the genetics and why I think that we're finding it so difficult to come with treatment strategies. This is the pathology of Alzheimer's disease. I started as a neurochemical pathologist looking at the pathology of the disease. What you see here is on the top left, you see the neurodegeneration, the large ventricles, and the clear evidence of neurodegeneration. Here you have a cross-section, and you can see the shrunken hippocampus. These are the pathologies of the disease. These are the tau tangles. These are the amyloid plaques, and this is the chondrophilic angiopathy around the blood vessels. This is what the pathology sees. But of course, this is the end stage of the disease, and what we could not tell is what came first, where the disease started. In 1983, Gusella showed in Huntington's disease, using the then newly, if you like, discovered technologies of genetic linkage analysis using DNA markers, was that the gene for Huntington's disease was on chromosome 4. And I was a postdoc at the time, and I thought what an amazing piece of work this was, because this, we could all see at that time, would allow you to find how the disease started. And so I decided to switch from looking at the pathology of the disease to trying to understand the genetics so I could see how the disease started. And I'm sure a lot of other people who were postdocs at that time made the same type of decisions. When people saw this type of pathology, they divided into, well, 3 or more camps. Those who thought the neurodegeneration came first, those who thought the tangles came first, and those who thought the plaques came first. And there was really no consensus. You're just looking at a car crash and you couldn't tell where the problem had started. One of those, the first person really to say that amyloid was where the disease started, the amyloid in the plaques and the chondrophilic angiopathy, was Glenner. He noticed, he got the amino acid sequence of amyloid, and then the same year he got the amino acid sequence of amyloid from a case of Down syndrome. People with Down syndrome always develop Alzheimer's disease, and he realized it was the same, and he wrote, when he realized it was the same, the sequence analysis showed it to be homologous to that of the amyloid peptide of Alzheimer's disease. This is the first chemical evidence of a relationship, and it suggests that Down syndrome is a predictable model for Alzheimer's disease. And so he clearly thought that the reason that people with Down syndrome got Alzheimer's disease was because they had 3 copies of chromosome 21 and the amyloid gene was on 21, so he clearly thought that overproduction of amyloid was one cause of the disease. But there were many, many competing hypotheses. We had started, together with Martin Rosser, then at St Mary's Hospital in London, we had started to collect families with Alzheimer's disease, and we had collected, because of a woman I'll show you in a second, we had collected this family, grandfather with Alzheimer's disease, 2 sons with Alzheimer's disease. These 2 sons have married 2 sisters. Here we have 10 children who were all in their 50s, 5 of whom had Alzheimer's disease. And here we had 3, 1 of whom had Alzheimer's disease. And you're looking at the top half of chromosome 21. And what you can see is all the affected members share the entire chromosome, but these 2 unaffected members have parts of the chromosome and don't have the disease, and that suggests the disease is between here and here, and the amyloid gene was right in that middle bit there. And when we sequence the amyloid gene, for those of you who are under 50, this is how we used to do sequencing. Here is a silver stained gel, and this is a normal individual from the family. This is an Alzheimer individual, and you can see this extra band here, which is a mutation, and that gives a valine to isoleucine change. And this was the first defined cause of Alzheimer's disease. And so we knew this was an important finding. We knew we'd found the first cause of the disease. I'm now going to show you the video of relating to the family, hopefully. Control F, that's what I have to do. Yeah.
The quest for medical treatments and cures isn't just about slides and microscopes and what can you do about the symptoms. It's about families, it's about individuals, it's about stories of people who suddenly begin to lose themselves in a way that's frightening for them and terribly painful for those who love them.
A lot of people would say that Alzheimer's disease research to some extent started with Carol's family.
All of them were between the ages of 54 and 58, and it was at that stage that our life changed, really.
We put an advert in 1985, 1986 in the Alzheimer's Society newsletter because we were interested in studying the genetics of Alzheimer's disease. And the very first letter I got was from Carol Jennings, and she had drawn her family tree, described her family tree.
The breakthrough itself came in 1991. We got a letter in January telling us they had identified a gene that they believed caused this Alzheimer's disease.
When we found the mutations in amyloid in Carol's family, we knew that that is where the disease started. It's been a dominant feature of all work on Alzheimer's disease. Carol's family has what's called autosomal dominant Alzheimer's disease, and that means that if your father or mother has the disease, you have a 50% chance of inheriting the gene, and if you get the gene, you're going to get the disease at a very similar age probably to your parent.
She's a shell of the woman she once was, but she's still my wife, and so she's still part of who I am. We may not be able to change the cards that life deals with us, but we can change the game we play with the cards we've got so that future generations don't have to carry the same pain.
I have to say, a really remarkable woman, and after she was, let's see if I can get back again. After she was, sorry, I can't find the mouse, here we go. After she was diagnosed, after we found the gene for Alzheimer's disease, the APP gene in her family, she became the volunteer national organizer for the families with frontotemporal dementia. She didn't want to work with Alzheimer families. She thought that was too close, but she became the volunteer organizer, and she herself still goes to the clinical team at Queen Square, the same clinical team, Martin Rosser and now Nick Fox, for her care. She's now too ill to actually go to the clinic. She's, obviously now severely demented. It's this all started with her, and I don't think I have that slide in, but she said when we found the gene, that she didn't think it would help her, but she hoped it would help her children. In fact, you saw a picture of her son on that slide. Her son now comes to Queen Square and is part of the research. So really, the family have been, well, and many other families the same way, have been really remarkable. Now, when we found the mutations, the families with amyloid mutations have an onset typically in their 50s, as you heard. Martin Rosser and I at the time had collected about 30 families with disease, with that form of disease, and 3 of them had mutations in amyloid, but most of them didn't. And years later, we all wanted to know what the other gene was, and the other genes, as it turned out. And Peter Hislop found the other genes, and they were genes called presenilins. And this is a picture of presenilin 1. There's also presenilin 2, which has a very similar structure. And when Peter cloned the gene, we did not know its function. This is its structure. But we now know that presenilin is the enzyme, the largest part of the enzyme gamma secretase, which cuts the amyloid precursor protein and yields amyloid. And here you've got a picture of it. It cuts many other proteins too. It's the major protein in the membrane which is responsible for cleaving protein, for cleaving transmembrane proteins. Here you have the amyloid precursor protein in the active site, and there's 2 aspartates, these turquoise aspartates here, which are responsible for cutting the amyloid precursor protein here. All the residues which are in red are residues which families with mutations have been described. The families with presenilin mutations typically, not always, but typically have an onset age between about 35 and 50, so it's generally earlier. The earliest onset I know about is a family from Poland with an onset age of 28. So these are really very spectacular and unpleasant forms of this disease. Nearly all of these cases largely resemble Alzheimer, the typical Alzheimer's disease you might see in the clinic, and their pathology is largely resembles that. I say largely, in these cases, and this might be one of the reasons we're having trouble with treatments, and we can talk about that. The pathology in these cases is a purer Alzheimer pathology. It's a very pure pathology. When you see an Alzheimer patient in your clinic, they will have vascular changes, they will have they will have other pathologies as well as the dominant Alzheimer pathology. So in a sense, what you see in the clinic is a more mixed dementia than these cases. This is a very pure plaque and tangle dementia. And that might be, just by the way, one of the reasons we're having trouble in terms of therapies, that the models we used are based on these findings, but what you see in the clinic has a more mixed etiology. Like, in fact, everybody who deals with diseases in the elderly will realize nearly everybody over certainly the age of 70 has mixed, unfortunately, has mixed pathologies, and I think that's a problem we've only just started to think about. Now, based upon those findings, which happened in the 90s, we drew this diagram. One fact I haven't mentioned, I'll mention before I go into the diagram, is we also found families with tau mutations. Remember I said that tangles were the other pathology? We found families where there were only tangles and no plaques, and in those families we found tau mutations. And so this diagram captures those thoughts. Amyloid, presenilin here yielding, APP, presenilins are cutting the APP, yielding amyloid, and that's leading to tau dysfunction, cell death and dementia. You can get cell death and dementia just starting with tau dysfunction like this. So this is the amyloid hypothesis. We drew this in 1998. When I drew this, I thought that we would fill in these embarrassing question marks within a year or two. I thought that we put these question marks up there. It clearly suggests experiments that we can do, and so one would expect those experiments would sort out these question marks. The other thing I will say is we modeled all of this in mice. We made mice with tau mutations, they developed tangles. We made mice with plaques, with amyloid and presenilin mutations. They made plaques. If you cross the plaque mice with the tangle mice, the tangles got worse, showing that plaques were upstream of tangles. So all of this fitted with this general scheme. But there are two, I still think this general scheme has truth to it, but there are real problems with it. The first is, we thought of this as a metabolic pathway which would operate over seconds. You know, I used to teach glycolysis to medical students. You change the concentration of glucose and the flux through glycolysis is changing within a second. I thought of it in this type of way. It's not like that. This process takes 20 years. And once a pathway takes 20 years, I think you stop thinking maybe of just this type of simple diagram. So that's one, I think, gross oversimplification. The other is that we draw this here, which we imply in a way is a neuronal membrane. And so we clearly were forecasting that putting amyloid outside a neuron would lead to tangles within that neuron, and therefore this was what we would call a cell autonomous process. I don't think that is really what we think anymore, and we think in fact that this question mark here doesn't hide a single event, but it hides a very complicated set of events which might take a long time. And so I think that this is still generally true, but the simplifications, well, they are gross oversimplifications. So these are old data, and before I just show some new data, I'll just explain how the amyloid precursor protein is metabolized. There are the two overwhelming pathways of metabolism are shown on the left and the right. Whoops. Here you have the amyloid precursor protein. In red is amyloid. You can either have cutting with alpha secretase, which does not yield amyloid, and followed by presenilin gamma secretase. This is presenilin here. This is, if you like, the good pathway. And this is the bad pathway. Here you have a beta secretase cutting here, and then gamma secretase cutting here, yielding amyloid. These are the two major pathways of metabolism. Before I go on, I will just say that we have very little idea as yet. The first papers, in fact, came out this month, 25 years later, saying what the function of the amyloid precursor protein is. We have not really known the function. I think that might be something that turns out to be important as well. But these are the pathways of metabolism. What happened genetically? Well, the first thing, much more recently, and we have found similar things, is that mutations in the alpha secretase increase your risk of getting disease. So mutations which inhibit this pathway make it more likely that you'll go down this pathway, and therefore more likely you will get disease. So that's consistent. And then this very nice paper from the DECO group in Iceland shows that in the Icelandic population there is a mutation which inhibits beta secretase, and that mutation is protective against Alzheimer's disease. So all very consistent then with the amyloid hypothesis. That's the good news. Now let's go on to what's happened with the treatment. Well, gamma secretase, it failed a futility. Patients actually got worse. So inhibiting gamma secretase made patients cognitively worse. We don't really know why that is. Beta secretase, patients also got, in fact, I put failed futility test. In fact, an update of that is that patients also got marginally worse. And again, we don't really know why. Direct amyloid immunization, this is a complicated treatment because everybody reacts to an immunization in slightly different ways, so you're not giving the same, effectively the same drug. It has mixed effects. Some people raise antibodies to soluble amyloid, and some raise antibodies to deposited amyloid. So it is a mixed effect and has variable effects on the pathology. But this failed in a phase 3 trial. Antibodies which target soluble amyloid, they reduce the concentration of amyloid, that failed a phase 3 trial. And at the moment, and there's other antibodies with the same characteristics, antibodies which attack and remove plaques failed are still in a phase 3 trial. We don't know there are several antibodies with these characteristics. We're still waiting for the result. Those trials are going on. The Alzheimer Congress in Lisbon is in 2 weeks' time, and we're all going to see if we can catch a word on how those trials are going. That's where this is up to. Why have they worked? Why have they not worked? Well, I've mentioned one reason, and one reason is one confounding factor is maybe the pathology in late onset disease involves more than just Alzheimer pathology. But I think that the one factor we really, as a field, believe is the problem is the problem about timescale. And these are the famous Jack curves drawn by Cliff Jack from the Mayo Clinic, based upon biomarker studies. And what he drew out, although in fact the data about this have been around since the 1990s, was that in fact the time scale is very, very long standing. So here you have time here. Let's say that this is a man who is brought into a clinic by his wife when he's 70, here at the age of 70, to the neurological attention here. That means that if he is going to go into trials, he's going to go into trials here. But we know now that his amyloid scans would have started to go up probably nearly 20 years previously. And the amyloid would have been maxed out here. And the drugs that I've just been mentioning with the exception of those drugs which remove plaques, those drugs do not really remove amyloid. What they do is prevent further deposition. So an overwhelming concern in the field is whether these drugs might have been the right drugs but given at the wrong time. Rather, I mean, I take statins every morning, but if you wouldn't give somebody who is having a heart attack a statin, even though it's the right drug. It's the right drug, but it's at the wrong time. And I think that is the kind of simple-minded analogy that we're using in part to describe the failure of the clinical trials, that maybe we should have been giving drugs to much earlier. I will also say, though, that even the drugs which remove plaque amyloid make a hidden hypothesis, and that hidden hypothesis is that a brain from which amyloid has been removed is equivalent to a brain in which amyloid has never been deposited. And that also is unproven. And so, you know, I think we're very, very concerned, you know, we have to be concerned about the timescale. And one of the things I'm going to finish by talking about is is the extent to which we can start to think about doing treatments down here at this time frame. So this is the ancient history that I've just gone through. And just to circle back to Glenner's original hypothesis, saying that the people with Down syndrome always get Alzheimer's disease, and saying that was likely due to amyloid. There are these families, we have about 5 of them in the UK, where there is in fact a duplication. This is chromosome 21 here. These are a lot of polymorphisms on chromosome 21. There are individuals who are, cognitively normal who've got an amyloid gene duplication. They don't have Down syndrome, but they do get Alzheimer's disease in their 50s. There are other individuals who have a duplication of chromosome 21 down here. They have Down syndrome, they have mental retardation and the faces of Alzheimer's, of Down syndrome, but they do not get Alzheimer's disease. So Glenner's hypothesis was completely correct, that it's the amyloid gene duplication, which is the major gene on chromosome 21. So what I've been talking about are very rare families. I would say if one said that 1% of families have either amyloid or presenilin mutations, that's as many as there are. 1% in fact is probably an overestimate. What happens in late onset Alzheimer's disease? Well, we're in the fortunate situation now of being able to do genetic analysis of late onset diseases by looking genome-wide, hundreds of thousands of polymorphisms across the genome, looking to see if they each show association with disease. And this is the international consortium which is doing this type of analysis. We're part of it, but in fact every group virtually in Europe and North America who've collected cases are part of it. And what you're doing is you're looking, do polymorphisms across the genome show association? You draw the chromosomes along here. This is ApoE on chromosome 19, which we've known about since the 1990s because of Alan Rose's work. Here you have the chromosomes, and this is the p-value here. You're doing 500,000 chi-squared tests, so you have to set Bonferroni correction very high. You set Bonferroni correction at 10 to the 7, that's why this line is. And everything which exceeds that line, you're allowed to declare as a gene for Alzheimer's disease. This is the first gene, and this is the first paper which made this point explicitly, that when we look at these genes, they all map to particular pathways. And I think that this is really the lesson of the second part of my talk. And the pathways that they map to are the innate immune system, and by the innate immune system in the context of the brain, what we largely mean, not entirely, but what we largely mean is microglia. And also, although Leslie wrote cholesterol metabolism, I would say lipid metabolism. Those are the two pathways we keep seeing are associated. All of these genes map to those pathways just about. And interestingly, a lot of these peaks here, which don't quite reach significant, map to those same pathways. And so although we have to be very careful of Bonferroni, one might suppose that a lot of these are true positives rather than false positives. So we might know even more genes than we are displaying here. Now, there's a very nice paper from Alison Goat, and that's the top paper here, and she made the point when she assessed these genes that one of the genes was the gene, in fact the gene is called SP1, but it encodes the protein PU.1. This is a transcription factor, it's a microglial transcription factor. So genetic variability in this microglial transcription factor is important. But she also noted that many of the other genes were targets of that transcription factor. So what she pointed out was that there was a network of genes, microglial genes, which were important, genetic variability in which was important. In parallel, we were doing an expression experiment, which is here, and this is actually on a database which you can access, called www.mouseac.org, mouseac.org, to look at the data yourselves. And this, we were doing whole genome expression in mice which developed plaques. So we were looking at mice which developed plaques because we put in an amyloid transgene and seeing what genes had their expression altered. And I'll talk about that in a second. I'm going to come back to this story in a second, but I'm just going to take a slight diversion. We, at this time, were working on all the genes we had found for neurodegenerative disease, for dementias, have been dominant genes. I thought it's likely that there were recessive genes. And so we had set up a collaboration with Murat Emre and Ebba Lohman in Istanbul to look at the children with children who had developed dementia. In fact, these people were in their 30s, whose parents were unaffected but consanguineous. And we identified these three families which had consanguineous parents and a dementia. So the parents were unaffected. These three individuals were homozygous for a gene called TREM2, and when we sequenced the gene, this was done by Rita Guerrero, we found these three mutations, Q33X, T66M, Y38C. These are obviously loss of function mutations because X means a stop codon. And so we had found this homozygous mutations in TREM2 which caused this recessive dementing syndrome. Why does this paper have this weird title? And the reason is that, in fact, this gene had been found about 5 or 10 years earlier by Lena Peltonen in Helsinki, and she had found it in families which had had both dementia and Paget's disease. And our clinicians had not identified these families as this rare syndrome with this title because they did not have Paget's disease. So it was not the same phenotype. So that was our finding. So these genes caused a recessive dementia. And when I'll go to the next slide first. Now, when you find a mutation, what you do is you look in all the databases and look at all your sequences to see if you've ever found that mutation before. And Rita did that in our Alzheimer's series. And we had, at that time, with our collaborators, about 1,000 cases and 1,000 controls. And she found this T66M once in a case, not in a control. Y38C 3 times in cases not in controls, Q33X, the clear loss of function, twice in cases not in controls. So that's 6 times in cases not in controls. Remember, we'd found these mutations homozygous in this syndrome. We're finding them heterozygous now in English and American Alzheimer cases. And then when we looked here, this variant, R47H, this variant we found 22 times in cases, 5 times in controls. So this is clearly a risk factor, increases your risk about 4-fold in Alzheimer's disease. So this is clearly, we've now found a variant which has a big effect on Alzheimer's disease. This is our paper, came in the New England Journal, back to back with this paper which we made rather similar findings from the DECODE group in the Icelandic population. And this, when we published this paper, I got a very nice email from this man here, Tom Bird, a scholar and a gentleman, and you'll understand why he was a scholar and a gentleman when I say what he emailed me. He emailed me and said, John, it's a very nice finding, but if you published this 30 years ago, you'd have beaten me. And what, in fact, he had published in the 1980s was this. What a terrible title. Would you ever write a paper with this title if you wanted it to be cited? He really should have learned. Anyway, he had noted these families with this bizarre recessive dementia, which we now call Nasu-Hakola disease. He had noted it, but he had noted that some individuals in the family had Alzheimer pathology. So he had said the two diseases were related. Now, at the same time, when we did this, we were looking at whole genome expression in these mice, which I mentioned a minute ago. I'm coming back off that little diversion now. And our collaborators had noted that, in fact, of all the genes in the genome, oh, wow, TREM2, of all the genes in the genome, TREM2 was the gene whose expression changed the most in response to Alzheimer's disease. So we made 2 findings, one a genetic, one a gene expression. This is an amyloid responsive gene. And when we looked at the other amyloid responsive genes, and this is the network of amyloid responsive genes, we saw that these other genes here, which are part of that responsive network, were also genome-wide association hits. And this was predictive because the next 2 genes we found were also part of this network. So what we're saying is not only is TREM2, variability in TREM2 important, and it's an amyloid responsive gene, we're saying in general genes which respond to amyloid deposition are important in Alzheimer's disease. So we decided to use that systematically and looked at this network again. This is that network blown up. There's TREM2, the gene which is associated the most, and so it's right in the middle of the network. Circled in red are the genes that were previously reported, and underlined in blue are the genes which we have now, just in the last month or so, described as Alzheimer genes. So we've now found a series of genes. This is that list of them. And for example, I think this is the easiest. These are the easiest to see. This is to do with cytokine release from microglia. This is to do with how do microglia respond to amyloid deposition. And that we're realizing is the key issue. Now what I've said so far I think is a fact. I'm now going to try and make sense of this as a fact. Looking at these genes, we've said that they're microglia and they're lipid responsive. And I think that this is the key to what's going on. ApoE, of course, differs in its lipid carrying capability. ABCA7, one of the clear Alzheimer risk genes, is actually a phospholipid transporter, explicitly a phospholipid transporter. TREM2 is a phospholipid receptor. So we're seeing that, and the other, what we're seeing here is genes which, microglial genes which respond to lipids. how can we put this with the amyloid story? What I would say is happening is that amyloid deposition, this is a hypothesis, is not starting in the extracellular space, but is starting in the membrane and is disrupting the membrane. And while your cleanup systems are working, then you can sustain amyloid deposition without becoming demented. But it's when your cleanup systems fail, and this is that long period when you've got amyloid deposited, it's when your cleanup systems fail that you switch from having amyloid in your brain to having dementia, and that's what I think is the problem. Now, can we treat earlier, and can we identify people earlier? And I think we can. This is work we have been doing. I say we. Valentina Escott-Price has been doing in collaboration with us and others, and she has shown if we use the genetic information in Northern Europeans, we can predict with a relatively high degree of certainty who's at high risk. So one can imagine a future where we do genetic analysis, let's say of people in their 50s, and follow those who are genetically at high risk to see, for example, if their CSF amyloid or their brain amyloid through scanning, or actually there's now a blood amyloid test which is on the way possibly to being validated, whether we can use those as ways of identifying people much earlier and perhaps starting clinical trials in those individuals much earlier in the way that we use statins now. So I am optimistic. It's going to be a long road, but I am optimistic that we're on the right road now.
Thank you. Thank you. All of you, is it on? Yeah, okay. Very complicated, very interesting. A lot of you people are together with John the rest of the day and can ask a lot of questions. We can't reach any questions right now. It's already on Twitter, so I hope you will have a lot of...
Sorry to talk for too long.
Yeah, but it was a very nice talk. Thank you so much. So I think we again have to put our hands together and give some greetings to John, and thank you for the presentation. And we have a little present for you too. That's all that we could afford. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Jeg switcher lige til dansk, fordi jeg vil lige godt lige præsentere for jer, hvad vi skal høre i næste uge. Der kommer Bo Bjerring Sørensen, han er overlæge på smerteklinikken. CRPS kaldes den også, klinikken i Glostrup. Det er en tilstand med komplekst regionalt smertesyndrom, altså refleksdystrofi kaldte vi det tidligere i gamle dage. Han kommer sammen med en patient, som også er formand for den forening. Det er en meget smertefuld, sjælden lidelse, som kan medføre ganske alvorlige tilstande, både akut og efterløbende. Så næste gang, der er det altså en læge og en patient sammen, så jeg håber rigtig mange vil være med på streaming og komme her i lokalet næste gang. Tak for nu. Folk, der ikke er med i det her gruppearbejde i dag med Bridge, de skal ud og arbejde med patienterne. Så nu har vi lært en masse og fået inspiration til dagen. Så kan vi tænke over alle de vanskelige spørgsmål, det her problem, som John kom med, har rejst for os. Tak for nu.